Got it. Bien, empezamos. Yo creo que hemos dado 5 minutos de cortesía y podríamos ir empezando. Yo creo que estamos ya un número suficiente de personas además. Bueno, bienvenidos todas y todos a las tertulias de Red MMT. Sabéis que intentamos hacerlas por lo menos una vez al mes. Y en esta ocasión me complace invitar a Fadhel Kaboub. Fadhel lo conocí en el MMT Conference que hubo hace 2 años. El año pasado sabéis que no se pudo celebrar. Es de un país mediterráneo, vecino al nuestro, Túnez. Doctor en Economía y Ciencias Sociales por la Universidad de Missouri, Kansas City, un centro universitario de referencia, ¿no?, para la teoría de la moneda moderna. Y bueno, actualmente es profesor asociado en la Universidad de Denison y presidente del Global Institute for Sustainable Prosperity. Anteriormente ha impartido clases en la Simon's Rock College de Bard y en Drew University, donde dirigió el Wall Street Semester Program. Y también me parece muy interesante que ha hecho trabajos de investigación para el Levy Economics Institute, el Economic Research Forum en Egipto, la John F. Kennedy School of Government de la Universidad de Harvard y el Center for Full Employment and Price Stability de Missouri. Desde una perspectiva MMT, Fadhel ha hecho, yo creo, un trabajo muy interesante o una aproximación muy interesante al concepto de soberanía monetaria. También ha tratado cuestiones sobre cómo países en vías de desarrollo pueden reducir su restricción externa y avanzar en el pleno ejercicio de su soberanía monetaria. Asimismo, ha promovido proyectos para introducir monedas locales en Estados Unidos, un proyecto que me comentó hace unos meses, que me pareció muy interesante. Y bueno, hoy queremos que nos dé a conocer su punto de vista sobre esos temas, la soberanía monetaria, la gestión de la pandemia también. Creo que es un tema que nos ocupa a todos y nos preocupa a todos, pero sobre todo desde la perspectiva de los países en vías de desarrollo, ¿no? Y los retos del cambio climático, que no podemos olvidar, aunque estemos en unas circunstancias que nos obligan a pensar constantemente en la pandemia, y bueno, su experiencia también con las monedas locales. Esta entrevista se ha pregrabado. A veces las hacemos en vivo y yo hago de intérprete. Eso, además de ser cansado, yo creo que resta un poco de viveza a las transmisiones y bueno, pues en algunas ocasiones hemos pregrabado y hemos subtitulado en castellano para aquellas personas que no entiendan el inglés, y tenemos a Fadhel con nosotros, así que tenemos aquí una especie de pliegue espacio-tiempo en el que tenemos a Fadhel Kaboub con nosotros simultáneamente en el pasado y en el presente. Y al final de la proyección del vídeo, pues vamos a darle paso a él para preguntas y conversación con el público asistente. Si todo sale bien, creo que conseguiremos transmitir el vídeo y vamos allá. So first topic of discussion, as I mentioned before when we were connecting, we've been having a lot of discussion. You know, there's a lot of Spanish-speaking countries which have issues with foreign debt, currency, dollarization, exchange rate management, frequent financial crisis associated to balance of payments problems and foreign debt. And we had some discussion with Argentinian economists in the last few weeks about some of these issues, and they argue that developing countries in Latin America will hit an external constraint if they try to apply policies such as the job employment guarantee. Functional finance for them is limited by the external constraint because they argue that those countries need access to foreign reserves, to foreign currency, to acquire a lot of their capital equipment, intermediate goods, etc. They have issues with pass-through effects on inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And in general, the proposals that are coming from the MMT field are applicable to Latin America. I retort that they are dealing with a distribution issue and that they don't want to address it. That's one of my main responses, is that they're not addressing the distributional issues, and that they're preferring of the population unemployed because they don't want to deal with those issues. And we also have some doubts as to the need for permanent currency management, the way it's been done in Latin America. But I think you have talked a lot about monetary sovereignty and currencies in developing countries from presentations I've been in the last year, for example, in the MMT conference.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have some pretty good insights about these issues. So you have the floor.
Thank you. Well, thank you again for the invitation, for hosting this event. So the concept of monetary sovereignty from an MMT perspective, we always talk about a spectrum of monetary sovereignty and countries having different degrees of monetary sovereignty. So one of the things I try to emphasize, and at least in the last couple of years, is that monetary sovereignty is not something that you declare by decree. It's something that you earn, something that you acquire through strategic policies. Mm-hmm. So you can think of developing countries who live under those external constraints and external debt burden and so on, who can over time implement strategic policies to acquire higher and higher degrees of monetary sovereignty, which allows you, once you acquire larger degrees of monetary sovereignty, it allows you to implement MMT-informed policies such as the job guarantee without having to throw your people under the bus. In other words, you become more resilient to these external constraints and external shocks. And that resilience allows you to have a flexible exchange rate to a certain degree without having to shut down your economy and throw millions of people into unemployment and poverty when you have an exchange rate fluctuation, or when you have a pandemic crisis, or when you have a global financial crisis. So let's try to think of monetary sovereignty and degrees of monetary sovereignty in terms of that resilience to external shocks. So it's not like a country either has monetary sovereignty or it doesn't have it. It's a spectrum, and that spectrum is not something that a country can declare, I belong to this side of the spectrum. So the question becomes, what are those policies that allow developing countries to acquire that additional resilience, to acquire that additional monetary sovereignty and degree of additional monetary sovereignty? So you start with assessing the situation currently. And I think most heterodox economists, post-Keynesian economists in general, are on the same page when it comes to what is really causing that, which is the external constraint. So it's the massive external debt. So the next question is, why do we have that massive accumulation of external debt over time? And it's the current account constraint. It's these, permanent structural trade deficits. So you dig deeper, and this is where it becomes specific country by country. What are the actual weaknesses in a specific economy that forces that structural problem that accumulates debt over time and creates that external debt constraint or external constraint? And it turns out for most developing countries, this is a broad generalization, we can look at specific countries. For most countries, it has to do with the lack of energy sovereignty and a lack of food sovereignty. These are two major things. You can't run an economy without energy. You can't run an economy without food, right? These are like the basic necessities. And then after that, there's several other components, of course. Most developing countries don't have access to capital equipment, don't have access to medical equipment, don't have access. So these are all the things you typically need to import. But the broader category of industrial output has to do with the value added content of what you produce, what you export versus what you import. So that includes obviously capital equipment, medical equipment, and so on. So over the decades, most developing countries have been told to industrialize, because that's been, the idea is that this is how you develop and move forward, and you kind of eradicate poverty and so on. But the problem is there's different kinds of industrializations. You can specialize in the lower end of the scale of the food chain, so to speak, which means you become the assembly line for the global supply chain, which means you import all the high value added content from more advanced countries, and you use cheap labor, you race to the bottom, you lower your labor standards, your environmental standards, you subsidize your workers' pension funds and so on, in order to attract foreign direct investment, in order to support export-oriented industries. But the value-added content of what you're producing is not sufficient to actually produce the real effects of economic development that you're aiming for. So industrialization for its own sake, without any real strategic purpose, has been a trap, actually, for most developing countries. Now, it has to be nuanced. So when you set up a factory for 500 workers, assembly line, you're actually supporting 500 families. I'm not denying that. It's important. It's kind of the short-term Band-Aid solution. But in the long term, it's actually a trap for a country as a whole. So how do you address those deficiencies that actually create the external constraint? You have to have an industrial policy. You have to have a sustainable, food, agricultural policy. You have to have a renewable energy policy. And here I have to add just one small footnote, because many developing countries are actually exporters of oil, for example, and gas, and major exporters.
Argentina, for example.
Yeah. So you have to understand that, energy consumption, you don't consume crude oil. You consume gasoline and kerosene and petrochemicals that go into all the industrial, that's where the value added is. So the concept of value added content also applies to the energy industry. So you find major oil producers, oil exporters, actually importing gasoline and kerosene and all the high value added content petrochemicals that go into paints and plastics and medical equipment and industrial equipment. So the idea of exporting crude oil, you're literally exporting raw materials. It's an extractive industry. It's not the advanced stage of refining petrochemicals, which typically happens in the West. And controlled by a handful of corporations who have the refining capacity and so on. So those are the problems. So when it comes to the debates that some of us in the post-Keynesian community and the heterodox community in general are having about developing countries and the external constraint, I think it's a matter of not having enough focus on what the issues are. So I think we're on the same page. So I think, and here I'm speaking for myself and maybe some people in the MMT community, we in the MMT community recognize the constraint, but then we're saying, what are the kinds of policies that we can put in place to untangle those constraints over time in order to allow countries to acquire larger and larger degrees of monetary sovereignty? And I think most post-Keynesians agree with that. I mean, it's been in the literature. It's just a matter of emphasis and nuance. It's not like MMTers are saying we should, transition to a flexible exchange rate today and everything will be better. I'll be the first person to tell you that that will be a disaster. You transition to a flexible exchange rate without introducing the other policies, without having a long-term strategic vision. Of course, you're going to have food riots the next morning because you're going to have a crash in the exchange rate and so on. Does that mean that in the MMT community, we don't believe in capital controls? Absolutely not. So there's a whole plethora of strategic policies, including capital controls, that need to be put in place, but not blindly for the purpose of isolating the country. It's for the purpose of acquiring that larger degree of economic sovereignty and monetary sovereignty.
Let me interrupt you a bit, because this issue of capital controls, I think, needs some further definition. It's a very broad term, in my opinion. You could consider the capital controls as restricting access to foreign currency, or you could consider capital controls as, introducing some sort of limits to the amount that foreigners can buy in the stock market. There's the whole spectrum of things that you could consider capital controls. And I think it's a criticism that maybe the MMT community has to maybe accept as a valid criticism, is what do we mean by capital controls? We should be very specific about what types of capital controls, and probably every country is different and has different situations. But I don't see much value, for example, in restricting access to foreign currency like a lot of Latin American countries are doing, like Argentina or Cuba, for example. Cuba is now getting rid of their dual currency system, but Argentina, for example, has a limitation. I don't see what value that does has, but that's one form of capital control. Certainly, it's restricting access to foreign currency. But we need to be specific. What do we mean by capital
Well, it's
controls?
hard to be specific because it varies from country to country.
Yeah.
And capital controls can become more intense during times of crisis for obvious reasons, and can be more relaxed during good economic times. So it has to be something that's managed. But the problem with the uncertainty about what capital controls mean, it creates that uncertainty for investors, for exporters, for importers, and so on. So I come from a developing country. I grew up in Tunisia, so I'm very familiar with these. As a student, going to study abroad, you have to get a license from the central bank in order to, pay for your expenses. As a tourist, if you're leaving the country, you have a certain tourist allocation, annual tourist allocation. So these are the little things that the average citizen deals with. But if you're a manufacturer based in a developing country, you need to import capital equipment. It varies from country to country how much access to foreign capital you have. So in some cases, if you're a strategic manufacturer, and strategic can be defined by the country in different ways. In the case of Tunisia, strategic means you're export-oriented, 100% for the purpose of exports. Those exporters get the most advantages so that they can buy the equipment that they need and so on. And over time, many of those restrictions become more relaxed so that the company now can keep up to a certain percentage in foreign currencies in their own bank account from their export revenues, which means those revenues don't go to the central bank. They stay with the firm and so on. And there are good reasons for this. But then when it turns out that the resources that particular company is accumulating, foreign currency reserves, is not necessarily for the purpose of accumulating capital and for investing in better technology and so on, that it's going to buying BMWs to the managers and buying properties abroad, then it becomes a problem. So corruption is a huge issue here, because for developing countries that have a focus on strategic areas like food imports, most developing countries have import licenses that are handed out to key individuals, sometimes government agencies, sometimes private or public-private partnership, where those individuals now have control over the food supply for the country. So if somebody like me or other progressives and people who are interested in food sustainability and food sovereignty say we need to develop the agricultural industry domestically so we don't have to import as much, then those individuals will do whatever they can to dismiss the research, to dismiss the arguments, to cut funding, to fund an opposition party that will do the opposite, because that will take away their economic power, their power in politics, their influence, and that's the nice way to do it. In some cases, it goes into violent attacks against individuals and workers and labor unions who are trying to develop a domestic industry to build that food resilience or renewable energy resilience and so on. So those are the nuances that I'm inviting my colleagues in the MMT community, in the post-Keynesian and heterodox community, to focus on those constraints that actually suffocate the capacity of a country from and stops it from acquiring a larger or higher degree of economic sovereignty. So whereas some colleagues in the heterodox community say we have an external constraint and there's nothing we can do about it other than trying to manage the exchange rate, I'm trying to say that there are ways we can manage the exchange rate that are much more effective and can actually allow a country to acquire that larger degree of economic and monetary sovereignty. And it has to do with corruption. And the way to do with corruption is not by fixing the exchange rate or borrowing from the IMF, it's by taxing and regulating the power of those industries and taxing and regulating their power out of existence. And empowering informed citizens and social movements with this particular lens in order to do the right push, political push, to deal with corruption, because you can't just say corruption broadly without naming names and explaining what, why those food riots are related to corruption, why the exchange rate instability and inflation, the pass-through effect, is related to corruption. And it gets more complicated when that corruption involves police or military or border control officers, because then it becomes like a state within the state that controls those resources. Because if you rely, and that's why I emphasize energy imports and food imports, especially food imports. This means that as soon as that exchange rate drops, you're going to have the pass-through effect. You're going to have food riots on the streets, unless you have the government stepping in to subsidize basic food, which in times of crisis, typically the IMF will come in and say, well, you can't increase subsidies, right? And that's why you have food riots. So this is really what I'm trying to get us to pass, past this this deadlock of managing the exchange rate. It's not sustainable, and it doesn't help us pursue policies of full employment and so on. So the question is, how do we get from here to there? What are the little steps that will allow us to gradually unlock? And there's no silver bullet. Sometimes colleagues think that the job guarantee will get us there immediately. The job guarantee is not a silver bullet. It can be a component in that transition to higher degrees of economic sovereignty. So first, you focus on the areas of weakness of your economy, and you start gradually shifting at least subsidies away from fossil fuels, away from imported foods, towards building that resilience domestically, building more food resilience, food sovereignty, energy sovereignty gradually. You can do this through diplomatic partnerships, playing the global superpowers and acquiring technological resources and acquiring, support for building that capacity. And here I'm thinking, obviously, it's not the US, it's not the European Union, it's China primarily that has at least an interest in gaining more influence in the global South. But it's not about giving up everything to China. It's about having an actual strategy. Because the problem with many developing countries is they sign these agreements without getting anything out of it. So you have to have, as many people say, if you don't have a strategy, you're actually part of somebody else's strategy. So don't sign any document unless you have a reason for it, not because you're just on the receiving end. No matter how small a country, you can manage to get something out of those deals. But you have to become more selective in the types of foreign direct investments you bring in. You have to become more selective in the types of industries you actually subsidize and support for export purposes. You have to be more strategic and selective in terms of what kind of tourism you want to bring to the country. If you're racing to the bottom, it's not sustainable, and we know that. And obviously the COVID crisis has exposed the weakness of all those policies. When FDI is gone, when tourism is gone, when export-oriented growth is brought to a halt because of the pandemic, you're left with nothing essentially. And now you're dependent, literally dependent on the rest of the world, the global North in particular, somehow restarting their economy so you can get, so they can revive yours. So that's not sustainable.
Right. And a lot of these countries are going to, now that you bring up the COVID crisis, and that's something I'd like to discuss as well. A lot of these countries now have to import a lot of course, not just something as basic as the mask, as the face mask. It was, we suddenly woke up in Europe to the realization that we didn't have the capacity to manufacture a mask, and we had to import them from China anymore. We had given up complete, whole swathes of our industrial capacity to China, and suddenly come this crisis, and we're not even able to supply the population with a mask. Well, now we have the vaccines. Vaccination is beginning slowly. I'm assuming gradually, production will pick up, and the logistics will be sorted out. And because that I think most of these vaccines have to be stored I think in the freezer. So it creates huge issues for a lot of the lesser developed countries in terms of the logistics. But one of the things we're going to see is that, of course, the countries who are going to get the vaccines first are the developed countries, and the underdeveloped countries will get them last. That means their economies will be in shutdowns and crisis for a much longer time because of the incapacity to get access to all these now strategic sort of goods, right? The mask, sanitary, so sort of medical equipment, vaccines, etc.
Yep.
How are these countries coping? What are the solutions for the developing countries? What can we do for them also in terms of getting out of the pandemic more quickly and get and as you said, their economic models, a lot of countries are based on export-led growth models, and therefore suffering even more as a consequence of the pandemic.
Yeah, with the first lockdown of the pandemic, many developing countries, pursued the lockdown for a few weeks and then simply had to give it up because there was no economic lifeline, and those governments didn't have the capacity to subsidize the entire workforce, almost the entire workforce. So those economies reopened. And the second wave hit in a bigger way. Now there's something sort of mysterious about why developing countries didn't get the biggest hit of the pandemic, given the lack of medical resources and so on. I will not claim to be the expert in this, but there's few possibilities that you can put on the table. One is that many rural areas of developing countries were just out of reach from tourism and international trade and so on. So that could explain why the spread didn't reach many vulnerable areas. Number two, developing countries have the youngest population, especially in the African continent, the youngest population, demographically speaking, on the planet. And we know that the most vulnerable are people with compromised immune systems or the elderly. The testing capacity was extremely low, so that also shows underreporting. It's possible that some of the deaths have not been reported as COVID, just elderly people get sick and die. So there's those things. But some of the more advanced developing countries who have much more interaction with Europe in particular, like North African countries, those are the countries we can see the immediate impact. Like Tunisia did the lockdown almost immediately, managed to bring the cases down to zero for several weeks, and then reopen the borders for very selectively to a handful of Tunisians and foreign partners to enter the country, with a relatively strict quarantine set of rules, and a lot of people broke the quarantine and end up actually restarting the second wave. And now Tunisia is dealing with a very painful second wave. So we know that the economy will be hurt, will be severely damaged by a second and third wave. And to this day, apparently Tunisia doesn't have access to the vaccines until maybe March at the earliest. So this brings the global response to how do we distribute the vaccine? How do we manage this? Now, some countries have a very significant pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity in the global south. Think of China, think of South Africa, think of India, Tunisia, Morocco. There are many countries in the global south. And apparently some of them have requested access to some of these vaccines to boost up manufacturing, were essentially rejected by the
patent system, basically.
This is
the patent system.
The patent system, and we've seen this before, almost 20 some years ago, with the HIV/AIDS crisis, when South Africa and China pretty much said, we know what the formula is, we're going to go ahead and do it without your permission because this is a human rights issue, and then ended up essentially getting a special license from pharmaceutical companies to do it. It's just this time, for some reason, we're not seeing that kind of pressure, even though the crisis is much more severe. And pharmaceutical companies, with the support of the US, obviously, and global North countries, are insisting on keeping control over the licenses and manufacturing and distribution. And that's going to just slow down the global economy more, and more people will literally die because of this. We've seen cases where in the occupied territories in Palestine, where Israel now is going to be probably the country that will reach the highest degree of vaccinations in a record time for just the Israeli population.
Right. But not the Palestinians on the other side.
As an occupying force under international law, you're actually responsible for the well-being of the people you occupy. And to this day, there isn't a single, vaccine available to the Palestinian population. So we have very serious issues at the global level in terms of how we respond to this pandemic. But from a global South perspective, it's been a disaster, compounded by the structural issues that we discussed earlier, which is heavy reliance on exports, on FDI, on tourism. So none of those engines will get restarted as long as the pandemic is raging the way it is.
It makes you wonder what the use of all the international agencies is, because the IMF, the World Health Organization, were supposedly set up for a purpose, right, in the post-war period, and they seem completely hopeless in managing this sort of situations, right? One would assume that one solution would be setting up some kind of international agency to ensure that these countries have access to the vaccine. It doesn't look like the World Health Organization is playing that role, nor are the northern, global powers interested in setting up that type of cooperation, right?
Yeah, because over time we've given up the power and authority of states and international agencies to corporations.
Right.
It's the pharmaceutical companies who run the show now. They give instructions to governments in terms of who gets what and who distributes what, and the governments are working for them now to distribute the vaccine and to get them the deals, and walk away with this after this pandemic more powerful and more influential than ever, and they're setting the standards for what comes next.
Right, and ironically, we are after all, I think the Pfizer vaccine was developed by a German company that was actually funded by the German government originally, and the technology came out of German universities. And now we give them the money to, we buy the vaccine so we're giving them the money. It's government money all along, from the beginning to the end, right? From the beginning of the research project to the final product, which is acquired by government health services, right? And somehow we seem completely incapable of deciding what has to be done, right? So I think it's very interesting.
That's what happens when sovereign governments abdicate their power.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. And especially acute in the European case, I have to say.
Yeah.
But okay. So I'd like to also, we're forgetting also, or I think maybe the blizzard, the snow blizzard that we received in Spain made us forget about the climate change episode. Well, I think it's just a fluke event. But we can't forget that there's an even larger crisis looming out there, the climate change crisis. And I know that you've been thinking about ideas and programs to tackle with climate change. I think one of the big issues I'm seeing here in Spain and in Europe, and from our perspective, with the policies that are being developed by the European authorities, are basically a combination of what we could call Pigouvian taxes, right? So you tax carbon emissions, you subsidize, clean technologies. You raise taxes on everyone, especially your utility taxes and so forth, and gradually shut down industries. But you're not creating any new employment, and you're probably making the issues of distribution and employment even more acute than they were before. So I think I'd be interested, and I think the public would be interested in different approaches, which would obviously we could talk Green New Deal, but I think MMT has a completely different perspective on how governments are managing the climate, the response to the climate change, and in a way that is fair and more balanced and probably more effective as well, because I'm not convinced that what the European countries are trying to do is going to work. at least not in the short time, maybe in the very, very long term, but not in the short term.
Yeah, so let's start with some, initial observation about where we are in terms of the climate crisis and how severe and how short the time frame is for a global response. The IPCC report from a couple of years ago now gave us 12 years, which means less than 10 years today. And that was a shock to the world that, how serious those statements were in that UN report. In the last year or so, there's been several reports from private banks, Wall Street banks. Some of those reports leaked to the public, to the media, that were referring to that IPCC report as extremely optimistic. So these are financial institutions, not your tree huggers, climate activists. So we know that the problem is serious when you know that insurance companies are taking it seriously and investment banks are taking it very seriously. From a purely financial risk perspective, from climate-induced financial risk. So that's the first observation. The second observation is, if this is severe, then we need a global response. So what MMT tells us is that different countries on that spectrum of monetary sovereignty have different degrees of monetary sovereignty, and as a result have different degrees of fiscal policy space, which means potential firepower to respond to the climate crisis and other crises that they deal with, economic issues and inequality and so on. So that tells us immediately that countries in the global south have very little space, fiscal policy space, to respond to the climate crisis. So the responsibility is primarily in the global north, the US, Canada, the UK, and so on. Another point of observation on the table: who's most responsible for CO2 emissions since the Industrial Revolution? It's clearly countries in the global north. You can nuance that by saying, well, look at China and India in the last couple of decades. True, but the carbon footprint of consumption that is manufactured in China and India is actually always in the global north. And we have data that allows us to actually quantify who's responsible for this. And of course, the response can't be just one country or just the EU. The EU, because of the existing legal constraints that you have, will essentially produce a very muted potential Green New Deal, which will not be sufficient. It's like dealing with a massive, forest fire with water pistols.
In Europe, they took the new out. They just left the G and the D, but they took the N out of the Green New Deal and left it a Green Deal. I think they didn't like. I think they didn't like the new part. It reminded them too much of the Roosevelt era.
Well, it's an American label, so it's understandable. It's really not the labels that matter. It's what you do with the policy. So I understand the fact that they want to stay away from an American label, which is fine. So the response has to be global. So the question that I've been thinking about in the last year or so is, how can we activate that massive firepower globally and organize it in a way that actually allows us to repair the damage, structural damage in the global south? So as soon as you start thinking about that question, you immediately think of transfer of resources from global north to global south to rapidly accelerate that transition. And some people think of it as aid. I'd like to think of it as climate reparations, as in acknowledging that the extractive policies of the global north and so on. And then you start thinking of the history of those policies, and you can't avoid but overlapping all of that history with a history of colonialism and neocolonialism. So you start looking at data today in terms of global financial transactions. And if you divide the world into global north and global south and net out all the transactions today, you find that the global south is transferring $2 trillion a year to the global north. So money is moving in the wrong direction. So that extraction of real physical commodities and is actually also an extraction of wealth. And that number is not new. It's not accidental. It's structural. It's been happening for the last 2 or 3 decades. UNCTAD has been reporting on this for a long time. And UNCTAD is actually one of the agencies last year that called for resetting the global financial architecture to address that particular negative flow of financial resources. So we need to reverse that to begin with. There's no way that the global south can deal with the climate crisis. So I've been calling for climate reparations for that climate debt, and I've been calling for colonial reparations for colonial debt. So that creates sort of a mechanism for transferring not only financial resources to the global south to accelerate the transition and repair the broken structures, but also transfer of technology and transfer of commodities in order to actually ensure that we're building a new ecosystem as in economically, socially, ecologically, that is resilient. Because at this point, we're not talking about stopping climate change. We're talking about adaptation and resilience to climate change that's already unfolding. And the time frame is really short for a global and massive response. So the question now becomes, how do we convince the global north to acknowledge this, number one, and then to foot the bill and actually transfer resources and so on? I think, unfortunately, it's going to require either a massive social movement that puts political pressure, and the fact that the financial industry is paying attention to this and taking it very seriously is encouraging, but it's not sufficient. We need the masses actually to put the pressure, not just the Wall Street bankers, because their response is going to be always muted and limited to protecting their industry and their interests. So we need social movements to demand climate reparations and colonial reparations, and to do it really rapidly. The other option is to wait until this crisis intensifies, and unfortunately it's going to be too late, and it's going to be scrambling to save whatever we can. Because now we know from, climate scientists are telling us that regions like the Middle East, for example, the Gulf region, will be uninhabitable during the summer months within my lifetime. So think of hundreds of millions of climate refugees moving to Europe, moving to the global north. And when people move, they're not going to move just for the summer.
No, they're going to stay
and
for
the kind of pressure it's going to put on housing, on food, on medical resources, on schools. This is not going to be sustainable, and we're not even preparing for that. So it's in the interest of the global north to do this right now under a climate reparations framework. If you don't like the term reparations, call it something else. I just like to call it what it is, because it's not aid, it's not charity. This is repairing the damage that was done. And of course, different countries can contribute with different degrees of financial contributions, of technological contributions. We just have to have a global mechanism for a massive and rapid response where everybody contributes what they can, as much as they can, to reset the global financial architecture and to address this existential crisis. One final word on the interest of the financial industry in this, and this is why they're really beginning to pay attention to this. And climate scientists and other economists and analysts in the green finance space have been saying this for a long time, but they've been ignored. But now this is finally hitting them in a more serious way. The so-called climate bubble or carbon bubble. Think of a financial market, stock market bubble. When it collapses, there's massive losses. So think of all the financial assets today that derive their value from the carbon intensive industry. Think of all the coastal properties, hotels and resorts and offshore oil, rigs and so on, that are worth trillions of dollars today, hundreds of billions of dollars today. When they're flooded, they're worth nothing, right? So all of those assets will become stranded assets. And estimates are putting this at least between 20 to 30 trillion dollars globally. And those are probably conservative estimates, which means you're going to have the biggest financial collapse in the history of the universe. And that's why many people in the financial industry now are taking this seriously, because they want to mitigate the risk, the financial risk associated with the climate effect. To the point that, about a year ago, Wall Street banks started issuing reports internally and essentially putting pressure and sending messages to the Fed that the Fed needs to introduce a regulatory framework to help with that mitigation. And the Fed is the last one of the major central banks around the world to actually come on board with this. There's an organization in Europe called NGFS, which is the Network for Greening the financial system. I think it was started by the Bank of England and other financial regulators in Europe and around the world. The Fed finally joined this organization just a few weeks ago, I think 6 weeks ago or so. The Fed made the first statement about climate change just 6 or 7 weeks ago. So the fact that the Fed is joining this and the financial industry in the US is recognizing this tells you that they're panicking, which is good news to some extent, but it's not sufficient just to have the insurance companies and investment bankers, design climate change policy for us. We need the fiscal side of governments to do this. We need political parties and social movements to put the pressure and to have a vision, a strategic vision. That's why I've been thinking of this global framework for climate and colonial reparations as a comprehensive way of addressing all of these interconnected issues, and these are multifaceted issues. So it's not enough to have some of us fight on the climate front, some of us fight on the financial front, some of us fight on the labor front. All of these issues are interconnected. And if we don't have a clear and coherent vision for the future, guess who's going to design this future for us? It's going to be the World Economic Forum. It's going to be Wall Street. It's going to be the financial industry. They're going to try to mitigate, kind of window dressing and protecting their interests first. And it's not going to be the kind of social justice and climate justice that most of us believe in.
Let me add one final question. You have done some work in local currencies with states and municipalities in the United States. You spoke to me about it last summer, and I was intrigued about it. And I was wondering if you could also just give us a couple of at least a short 5-minute presentation of what your idea is and what it could do in terms of creating jobs, improving communities, etc.
Yeah, so this is obviously sort of plan B. Plan A is to have sovereign governments through the democratic process, do the industrial policy, the jobs policy, the agricultural policy, and so on. And in the US, when the pandemic started, the way the US system is set up, states and municipalities are fiscally constrained, just like states within the European Union are fiscally constrained by tax revenues or whatever the markets will let them borrow, right? So obviously during the crisis, states and municipalities are dealing with the pandemic, dealing with an economic shutdown, and have no financial resources to provide basic services, including health services and security and transportation and support for people who were forced to stay home and people who lost their jobs. And eventually the statement was very clear from the US Senate. The leader of the Senate, Mitch McConnell, told states and municipalities, go file for bankruptcy. Don't expect any help from us, the federal government. And to me, that meant that the power of the purse, the sovereign issue of the currency, the federal government has officially abdicated its responsibility to deal with the crisis at the state and municipal level. So now, how can local municipalities and states address the crisis when they don't have access to financial resources from the federal government or from taxpayers at the local level or from financial markets? So the idea of a complementary currency or a community currency is literally, as the name indicates, is to complement the existing economic system, monetary system, and to spend in the most neglected areas of the local economy, neglected by the market, neglected by the state, by the federal government. So it's a question of design. And what we know from an MMT perspective is that what gives a currency value is the fact that it's required in payment of taxes. Otherwise, it can thrive for a while because you have lots of commitment and marketing and kind of the passion of the individuals who set up the community currency, because there are hundreds, thousands of community currencies around the world. They tend to be small. They tend to thrive during crises. They tend to thrive primarily because of the passion and commitment of the individuals in the community who want that program to succeed. And it requires quite a bit of marketing to convince people to use it and so on, which means as soon as that little crisis goes away, that currency, local currency, fades away. So we're trying to set up a complementary system that can actually coexist with the existing system past this initial crisis, and can be there in place to deal with the next crisis immediately when it launches, as opposed to waiting for the design. So we need the local tax authority to be on board, which means the local tax authority has to either issue the currency and then require it in payment of taxes to the municipality or the state, so sales tax, property tax, taxes, fines, and fees, right? And there is legal precedent for this, because in the US, municipalities issued actually complementary currencies during the Great Depression. We have legal precedents where municipalities around the world actually accept in payment of taxes, fines, and fees and penalties, other things other than the national currency. When they confiscate somebody's boat, when they confiscate somebody's car, that's payment in kind for a particular fine, for a particular violation. Municipal judges, in many cases, can assign penalties that are not denominated in the national currency. The penalty can be community service. The penalty can be going through a rehabilitation program for addiction or something like that. So we have legal precedent that says the tax authority can require other things in payments of taxes, fines, and fees. So here we have a framework where the local authority can issue a local currency, because then it becomes literally a tax credit, because that's a unit that you can issue into existence to pay workers for goods and services that they provide. And then that currency circulates with one-to-one exchange rate with the actual national currency, because everybody knows they can use it to pay their utility bill the same way they use the US dollar to pay their electric bill. They can use it to pay their taxes to the municipality. They can use it to pay a speeding ticket. They can use it to pay sales tax. So as long as you have a handful of large institutions within the community, primarily the power company, the water company, the major utilities on board, so that they allow their customers to pay their bills with it, then they turn around and pay their taxes to the municipality with that same currency. So the issuer gives it to individuals, individuals use it to pay their bills, the bill companies, in this case utilities, go back and pay the municipality or the state with the same thing. So it's money spent into the economy, it circulates for productive purposes, it goes back to the tax authority. So it's complementary, it's not meant to replace the US dollar. So that's really
municipal taxes drive local currencies, right?
That's the short design. Right. The problem is tax authorities are hesitant to put in place. I mean, they see it, they can picture it, but they're hesitant because somehow they're holding on to the hope that somehow the crisis will be over, somehow the federal government, maybe after the Biden administration takes over, things will be better. But they'll be better to some extent, because we all know that during times of high levels of economic activity, low levels of unemployment, there are communities that are literally excluded from that prosperity, from that economic growth, from access to resources. Millions of people are unemployed during the best economic times. And that's why complementary currencies become the tool that we can use to allow local communities to spend in the most neglected areas. And to validate what I'm trying to say, when I talk to municipalities and tax authorities, I tell them, by the way, you're already doing this. You just don't recognize it. So when you're giving a tax credit to a company like Amazon to set up a warehouse in your district, you're literally giving them tax credit. That's what we call it, right? Which means we're asking you to give us, the community, the same advantage you're giving to Amazon. In other words, give us a tax credit that allows us to create jobs, to address the socioeconomic issues, and then we'll give you that tax credit back. Except Amazon, takes advantage of the tax credit, and then they take their profits and leave because they're not going to reinvest it in the community. At least we, the local community developers and job creators, we're not going to take the money and leave. This is a way to develop internally. So just give us the same tax advantages you give to corporations who don't give you anything in return other than extracting value from the community and using it as a storage unit for their business.
Bien. Bueno, quiero agradecer a Mauricio Morúa que me ayudó con la tarea de subtitular, de hacer la traducción de la entrevista. Y bueno, ahora la oportunidad está abierta para que para que todo el público participe y transmita sus preguntas a Fadhel. So Fadhel, we now have an opportunity to interact with the public. I'm not seeing your. No, I wasn't seeing all the images. There we are. Okay, so we have about 32, 33 people, 33 spectators. I think there's also somebody or a couple of people in our Facebook account, and there's also in a Costa Rican association called Surcos that is also live streaming the interview. So a public from, I guess, 2 different continents, from Europe and America, from Mexico, from Argentina, from Costa Rica, from Spain. Y bueno, pues adelante, si alguien tiene una pregunta, que nadie sea tímido y que se lance. César tiene preguntas. César from Argentina has a question. Tienes que abrir el micro. Habla despacito que luego tengo que traducirle a Fadhel, ¿de acuerdo?
En Argentina tenemos mucha experiencia con las monedas complementarias. En la crisis del 2001 llegamos a tener más de 30 o 40. Prácticamente cada provincia tenía monedas complementarias. Y fue lo que nos sacó de la crisis. O sea, después hubo una imposición del Fondo Monetario y nos obligaron a rescatarlas al Estado Nacional. Pero fue un mecanismo que ayudó muchísimo. Y hoy el Instituto de Asociación, el INAES, tiene proyectos de poner la moneda complementaria para dar créditos y no la están autorizando desde el gobierno central. Nosotros podemos decir que fue una experiencia exitosa y es válida para la Argentina como crear sistemas monetarios. El mayor éxito que se tenía en la moneda complementaria es que se servían para pagar impuestos y servicios. Por consiguiente, era la moneda de circulación. Era ese comentario que quería hacer.
Okay, so Cesar is actually commenting rather than asking about the Argentinian experience. He says that in the 2001 crisis, there were a lot of these complementary currencies set up. There was a lot of experience, and he says about 30 or 40 of them in that period. Almost every province had a complementary currency. And he says that helped Argentina out of the crisis. But then the IMF forced the Argentinian government to sort of redeem those currencies and get rid of them. He also is commenting that the INAES, an association or an organization which he's affiliated to, is promoting a complementary currency project, but they're finding obstacles from the central government. But it seems that the largest reason for success of those local currencies in Argentina was the fact that they could be used to pay local and provincial taxes.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so, ¿más preguntas? Do you want to comment on that, Fadhel?
I wanted to say absolutely. I mean, this is a classic case. Argentina's, especially the Patecones currency, was probably the most popular, at least for us looking from the outside. Same was true in the US. I mean, this is true in every country. Every time there's a crisis, you see hundreds of these complementary currencies popping up. Not all the designs are the same. The ones that are designed with links to the local tax authority tend to be more stable and can survive beyond the crisis. But on the idea of complementary currency in general, one of the things that MMTers have frequently said is that we have way more complementary currencies than we actually recognize. For example, many of us go to the supermarket, and before you pay, you scan your supermarket card. And you get bonus points. You collect supermarket points that you can use to buy gasoline at a discount, or you get free stuff from your airline miles, right? You travel and sometimes you get a free ticket every few flights. All of those are technically complementary currencies. It's a club of businesses that agree to give each other's discounts, essentially. So it's like a buy local campaign that's limited to, you know, your airlines, your shopping mall, your supermarket, whatever club of businesses. That's also a complementary currency. We're just saying we're designing a similar one with all the businesses in the city, with the city or municipal authority in charge of issuing the currency and accepting it and payment of taxes. And once you recognize that a city can do this, then you send a message to the national government saying, we don't have to invent multiple local currencies. This is your responsibility to fully fund public services instead of having to invent a secondary and complementary currency. So for me, my goal, plan A, is to have the federal government, the national government, do the right thing. Plan B, if they abdicate their authority and let their people suffer, then the local authority has the responsibility to organize itself and complement the missing components from the national government. And that's where complementary currencies comes in.
Bueno, ha sido una respuesta larga, así que intentaré acordarme todos los puntos, pero básicamente dice que sí, que la experiencia argentina, en especial la de los patacones, fue una experiencia exitosa que se ha tenido en cuenta desde fuera, ¿no? También ha habido experiencias en Estados Unidos, ha habido múltiples experiencias, ¿no? Yo añadiría aquí en España, por ejemplo, durante la Guerra Civil nosotros tuvimos también algunas monedas locales en algunas zonas que estaban más aisladas de la zona republicana, ¿no? Y no todos los diseños han sido igual de exitosos. Los que han estado vinculados más vinculadas a la divisa nacional han tenido más éxito. Él recuerda que desde el punto de vista de la TMM hay muchas más monedas complementarias en las que no nos fijamos, como por ejemplo las tarjetas de fidelización, de las líneas aéreas, de los supermercados, de los comercios, que son básicamente sistemas para fomentar la compra local, ¿no? Organizados por asociaciones o por empresas, ¿no? Y por último concluye con que en realidad lo que proponen ellos no es tener que montar todas estas monedas complementarias, sino que sea el gobierno federal, el gobierno central, el que financia adecuadamente los servicios sociales de forma que eso sería el plan E, digamos, y que no tengamos que recurrir al plan B de las monedas locales. ¿Más preguntas? Casi todos tienen el micro apagado, por si acaso cuando quieran preguntar.
Mauricio tiene levantada la mano, ¿no?
Mauricio Gutiérrez, sí. Adelante. Okay.
Yo tengo una pregunta, ¿me escuchan bien?
Sí.
Ok, ¿la hago en español, Stuart, o en inglés?
Sí, yo traduzco, o como tú quieras. Okay. Si la haces en inglés ahorramos una traducción para acá, Fadhel, pero luego hay que traducirla al español. Así que tú hazla bilingüe si quieres.
Ok, bueno, voy a hacerla en español. Está relacionado al FMI y a un préstamo, bueno, es muy particular de Costa Rica. Está relacionado al préstamo que el gobierno de Costa Rica está negociando con el FMI. Y algo que ha sido muy frustrante para nosotros es que nos están bombardeando los medios de comunicación con una narrativa que es esencialmente la siguiente. Tenemos que sacar este préstamo con el FMI porque si no se viene el apocalipsis, básicamente. Entonces sería muy lindo poder tener un estado de bienestar con salud pública, educación pública, vivienda de calidad, pero ahorita no podemos porque hay que balancear el presupuesto y entonces este préstamo es imprescindible. Entonces es una narrativa pseudo progresista, yo diría. Entonces sabemos que hay otras opciones y la pregunta que yo le quiero hacer a Fadhel es si puede hablar un poco de esas otras opciones que hay, digamos como permitirle al Banco Central que directamente emita dinero o bueno, que tal vez pueda hablar, que hable un poquito más del control de capitales o que trate de ser lo más concreto posible y que mencione, que explore algunas de las opciones que hay en vez de endeudarnos más en moneda extranjera con el FMI.
Okay.
Eso sería, hago yo no, haces vos la...
lo intento hacer yo, sí. He's talking about a development in Costa Rica right now. The government is negotiating a loan from the IMF, and the argument is that basically they need the loan, otherwise, you know, the whole, you know, all hell will break loose, and that really they need it. It would be nice to have a you know, a good you know, social protection system and a good you know, welfare state, but this is not the time. We have to balance the budget. So there is, in a sense, a sort of a pseudo-progressive narrative in the justification for the need of this IMF loan. And he's asking, Mauricio from Costa Rica is asking if there are other possibilities, such as having the central bank fund the government directly and issue local currency, or other arrangements that would help Costa Rica get around the need for a loan from the IMF. And I'd like to remind the listeners, just in case anybody wasn't paying attention, that 2 days ago, this is Bolivia decided to repay the loan that the previous government, the one that had displaced Evo Morales in a coup d'etat, basically, had negotiated with the IMF, and they paid it back in advance because they thought it was damaging the Bolivian economy, and I think and that the conditionality was unacceptable. So that's interesting that this happened just 2 days ago. Okay, so your floor, Fadhel.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So a shout out to our Bolivian central bankers who count several post-Keynesian and MMT and Ford economists there. I'm actually giving a talk to their staff next month. So I'm optimistic about what we can do in Bolivia in the next few years. So to answer your question, Mauricio, and hello to everybody in Costa Rica on the call. The central bank will essentially always provide local currency.
Can I ask you to do it sort of like in shorter?
Slow it down.
Well, okay. I have to translate at the same time in Spanish, and it just gets harder when so I'm going to just translate that first. Yeah, sorry. Así que, bueno, lo primero que ha dicho es que efectivamente que ahí ha habido asesoramiento de economistas post-keynesianos heterodoxos al Banco Central de Bolivia, y bueno, incluso él va a dar una charla en Bolivia, creo que en la semana que viene, creo que ha dicho, o en unos días. Y bueno, pues eso es un desarrollo positivo. So, I'm sorry, now you can go on. I'm just going to try to make shorter sentences so I can do the simultaneous translation or the sequential translation. Yeah.
On the Costa Rican case, and this is true for all central banks, this is a usual misunderstanding that we hear frequently in the media, repeated by central banks, repeated by the IMF, which is that the country needs X number of millions of dollars in order to support the salaries of teachers or nurses or doctors, or to build schools or something like that. But in reality, when the country received, say, $300 million to pay for the salaries of those, essential workers, the government is not paying them in dollars. The government is paying them in the local currency. But those $300 million arrive at the central bank as foreign currency reserves now. So the central bank always monetizes the local spending. The question is, why does it have to be $300 million from the IMF?
Sí, lo que está diciendo es que en el caso de Costa Rica, pues hay un error de comprensión, ¿no? de los medios, del Banco Central, del Fondo Monetario Internacional, que, bueno, pues se lanza este mensaje que el país necesita X millones de dólares para afrontar el pago de los salarios de los maestros, enfermeras, médicos, construir hospitales, etcétera. Pero luego lo que ocurre realmente es que esos, los X millones de dólares llegan al Banco Central y se acumulan en forma de reservas, y en realidad el gobierno va a pagar esos salarios en la moneda local, ¿no? Así que, bueno, pues digamos que esa es la primera error de comprensión. No se pagan dólares, ¿no? a los asalariados del Estado, ¿no? So, go on, sorry, carry on.
Yeah. So then the question becomes, what do we do with the $300 million at the central bank? And this varies massively from country to country. In some countries, now the government has $300 million to buy weapons. In other countries, the government has $300 million to invest in renewable energy so that you reduce your energy imports. That's a huge difference in terms of the long-term impact of those loans. But it's really in the hands of the elected officials to decide what to do with the $300 million. In corrupt countries, those foreign currency reserves are available to support exports, which means companies that have exclusive export licenses, now their managers can have access to $25 million to import equipment or technology, but also they can import BMWs too for their company. So this is where the democratic process and having a strategic vision matters. But what the general public hears is, thank you, the IMF, you paid the salaries of the teachers and doctors and nurses. But it's not true, right? In practice, it's not true. So this is where an informed public, an informed social movement, and an informed political system, because many politicians don't understand this, right? So it becomes a question of, what do we do with that loan? Will it actually generate the positive economic impact that we want for the country? So now it allows us to separate these two things. We can fund the teachers and nurses and doctors locally, right? We don't need an IMF loan for that. Now, what do we need external currency reserves for? That becomes, now you're on the first step to thinking strategically about, why do you need to borrow money, for what reasons?
Ok, bueno, entonces supongamos que llega ese préstamo de $300 millones al Banco Central y la cuestión es qué se va a hacer con ese dinero, ¿no? Puede utilizarse para comprar armamento en unos países, o en otros países se utilizará para invertir, por ejemplo, en renovables y reducir la dependencia energética, ¿no? Esa diferencia es lo que, digamos, lo que marca el impacto a largo plazo, ¿no? La visión estratégica que pueda tener el gobierno, ¿no? En manos de un gobierno más corrupto, bueno, pues a lo mejor eso acaba en manos de exportadores que pueden, sí, adquirir bienes de equipo, pero también acabar adquiriendo BMWs, ¿no? para los directivos. Y bueno, pues depende un poco de esa visión. Lo que ocurre es que, bueno, aquí el dinero llega, efectivamente se van a pagar esos salarios, quedará el mensaje de que hay que ser agradecidos con el Fondo Monetario Internacional, pero en realidad lo que necesitamos es informar, un público informado, necesitamos unos medios informados y toda una clase política informada, porque muchas veces la propia clase política es la que no entiende lo que está ocurriendo y las posibilidades que tienen, ¿no? Entonces, efectivamente, si empezamos a pensar en qué se puede hacer con esos fondos, digamos, o préstamos procedentes del Fondo Monetario Internacional o otras fuentes del extranjero, siempre podremos, desde luego, pagar a los maestros, a los enfermeros, a los médicos con divisa local, con la divisa nacional, pero entonces podemos, si eso sabemos que no depende de la ayuda internacional, podemos empezar a pensar estratégicamente qué hacer con ella, ¿no? Y bueno, ahí es donde empezamos a pensar de otra manera y encontrar utilidad en esos fondos. So go ahead, Fadhel.
So then the question becomes, what do we spend, what do we need foreign currencies for? And that brings me back to what I explained earlier in the presentation. It depends from country to country. What are the pressure points on your external constraint? If those are food, if those are energy, if those are technological resources, then you start prioritizing those things. Otherwise, if you don't, then you're always worried about, if we spend the equivalent of $300 million to hire doctors, nurses, and teachers, then you worry about what they're going to do with their money, right? In a free country, they're going to buy food, they're going to buy cars, they're going to buy cell phones. So that puts pressure on your external constraint. Right? So what most countries do, they say, we're not going to hire the doctors and nurses and teachers because they're going to buy food, they're going to buy energy, they're going to buy, imported cell phones, and that will create pass-through inflation effect. So we don't serve the people in order to protect the country from inflation. That's just, the wrong strategy.
Vale. So, bueno, pues dice lo que Que tenemos que depende de las condiciones de cada país y dependiendo de esas condiciones, perdón, utilizaremos las divisas para una cosa u otra, ¿no? Ahí es donde hay que analizar los puntos de presión de la economía, si son alimentos, la energía. Dependerá un poco de cada país. Lo que ocurre es que si gastamos en contratar esos maestros, a esos médicos o enfermeras, entonces la preocupación que va a empezar a surgir es que, claro, estos van a utilizar los recursos para comprar alimentos, energía o incluso celulares, ¿no? Y entonces empezamos a preocuparnos y empezamos a restringir el gasto que hacemos en la población, porque nos empieza a preocupar los efectos del gasto, ¿no? Y nos empieza a preocupar que puedan destinarlo a ese tipo de gasto consultivo, así que al final acabamos creando una situación en la que acabamos, digamos, abandonando a la parte de la población para evitar esos efectos, ¿no? Okay, so, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I thought this is relevant here to answer Alfonso's question in the chat. How can a country calculate its fiscal policy space based on the degree of monetary sovereignty they have? Because that becomes now the relevant question once we understand this. And this is tricky. We don't have an empirical model that I can send you to right now. Actually, Scott Fullweiler, myself, and a few other colleagues are working on this as we speak, and it's a monster of a project. We're understaffed. This would be something that a small army of economists, working for a government agency should be doing. But in the meanwhile, we'll try to, develop the basics of it. So hopefully some of this work will appear soon. So here's a simple example that will help us estimate the fiscal policy space that a country has. Let's say a country decides we have national priorities to build renewable energy infrastructure, to build hospitals, to build housing units because we have shortage of housing, whatever those national priorities are. And then we do the math and we realize this will cost $10 billion in the next 5 years worth of spending. So now we want to pay those workers decent wages, right, to build those resources. So we figure out, what's the, average decent wage annual salary package for those workers. And then we look at existing surveys, consumer spending surveys, and try to figure out what does the average family earning an annual income of X dollars, how do they spend their money? We know that they spend a certain percentage on food, on clothing, transportation, entertainment, all kinds of things. We actually have surveys.
Yeah, sorry, it's getting too long to just...
I forgot.
Yeah, the problem is I forgot what you said at the beginning. Okay. Mira, se refería también a una pregunta que me parece que era Alfonso en el chat. Ahora hago el repaso a las preguntas del chat. En la que él preguntaba cómo puede calcular un país su espacio fiscal basándose en su soberanía monetaria. Y bueno, Fadhel dice que es un proyecto enorme en el que están trabajando, pero bueno, estaba poniendo un ejemplo, ¿no? Entonces, para calcular el espacio fiscal de un país, lo primero que tiene que hacer es pues, decidir cuáles son sus prioridades estratégicas en términos de vivienda, de hospitales, que son instalaciones energéticas, y calcular el coste de esos proyectos, que puede ser, por ejemplo, supongamos 10.000 millones de dólares. Y una vez, hecho ese cálculo, tendrá que ver cuál es el salario promedio porque habrá que pagar decentemente a esos trabajadores y habrá que calcular, qué renta van a percibir y hacer encuestas o estudios para determinar el gasto típico, la cesta de gasto típico de una familia con un determinado nivel de renta para conocer cuál va a ser la composición del gasto. So, go on.
So let's say based on these estimates, we realize that we need to hire 2 million people to build this infrastructure for the next 5 years. And now we realize out of those 2 million people, we figure out based on those consumer spending surveys, how much of that money will be spent on food, how much on transportation, how much on additional demand for housing, additional demand for clothing. All of these things we can estimate immediately, before we start anything. And then we ask ourselves, does the economy have the internal productive capacity to provide those additional housing units, those additional food units, those additional entertainment units that the public will use based on this new economic spending? And if the answer is yes, then I'm not worried about inflation. So we have the capacity. If the answer is no, then we know we hit the limit, say in housing or energy or clothing or whatever the area is. Then it becomes a question of how do we mitigate that risk of inflation in those key areas? And I'll continue. Okay. I'll give you a chance to translate.
Okay. Bueno, pues entonces supongamos que este plan de inversiones requiera contratar a 2 millones de personas. Tenemos que averiguar cuánto gastarán en alimentos, en vivienda, en vestimenta. Una vez hechas esas estimaciones, tenemos que preguntarnos si la economía tendrá la capacidad interna, digamos, para producir esos bienes, ¿no? Y servicios. Si la respuesta es que sí, entonces no nos debe preocupar el riesgo de inflación. Si la respuesta es que no, hemos, digamos, topado con un límite y en ese caso, pues tenemos que, bueno, pues ver qué podemos hacer para mitigar el riesgo de inflación. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. So notice in this framework, we're focusing on the real resources because that's what determines the inflation constraint. I'll add one more component to this analysis, which is not just the availability of productive capacity to produce the additional resources, but also concentration of market power in those key areas. So if you realize that we have heavy market concentration, say in the food imports area or in the housing area, then we need to not only worry about the availability of resources, but worry about taxing and regulating that market power out of existence, democratizing that market segment, making it more competitive via the policies that we put in place. And I'll continue in a second.
Okay. Bueno, pues en este marco analítico nos vamos a centrar, por tanto, en los recursos reales disponibles, ¿no? Y no solo en la capacidad productiva, sino también es conveniente analizar la concentración de mercado, ¿no? De poder de mercado en diversos segmentos, sea el de alimentos, el de vivienda, etcétera. Y en ese caso, si observamos que hay esos fenómenos de concentración de poder, pues habría que además empezar a hacer un estudio del modelo fiscal y del tipo de reglamentación que necesitamos para conseguir que esos segmentos sean más competitivos y más democráticos.
So now, once we have this in place, now we can say if, for example, those consumers would be spending in 20 different industries, hypothetically, and if out of those 20 different industries, there's 4 of them that will constitute inflation pressure points for the economy, then we know that we shouldn't spend the full $10 billion on those projects. Instead, dedicate maybe $1.5 billion to mitigating the risks of inflation, either by spending more to build internal productive capacity, say for food or energy or housing, whatever it is, and have in place a plethora of regulatory interventions to democratize those markets and actually relieve the pressure point in those areas. Now we know we can safely spend the other $8 billion in the economy without spiking inflation in those 4 categories. So that's the kind of strategic thinking that an MMT-informed policy would have. This way, you're increasing productive capacity, you're serving the needs of your people, of your economy, without causing inflation. But most models say, we're going to spend $10 billion and let's hope for the best and wait for inflation. Or they have a theory of inflation that says, oh, it's the deficit that will cause inflation, or the national debt that will cause inflation, or the central bank that will cause inflation. And look where we are with these theories. I mean, even the mainstream economists are recognizing their theories of inflation are unreliable. So this is, you can think of this as the MMT alternative to inflation theory. This is the alternative to inflation targeting, right? The central bank inflation targeting. because it's the real resources and market concentration that determine inflation, not central bank policy.
Bueno, entonces supongamos que de 20 sectores económicos, 4 se pueden considerar que tienen características inflacionarias, ¿no? Y en ese caso, pues identificamos, por tanto, a esos 4 sectores como puntos de presión inflacionista, y la estrategia entonces debería ser no gastarse los 10.000 millones de dólares en esos proyectos, sino que habría que quizás apartar, digamos, 1.500 millones para mejorar la capacidad productiva, para reducir, para aumentar la competencia, para, digamos, proveer esa capacidad doméstica. Y entonces podremos gastarnos los otros 8,5, ¿no? 8.500 millones en el proyecto, en los proyectos, digamos, estratégicos, ¿no? De esa forma, bueno, pues pensando de esta forma estratégica, bueno, pues conseguiremos primero incrementar la capacidad productiva. En segundo lugar, satisfacer mejor las necesidades sociales o dar una mejor atención a las necesidades sociales y evitar las presiones inflacionistas. Desgraciadamente lo que se suele hacer es que se suelen gastar los 10.000 millones en los proyectos inflacionistas, ¿no? En los proyectos estratégicos. Surgen a continuación por esa falta de planificación, surgen esas tensiones inflacionistas. Y se le acaba culpando, digamos, al déficit público, a la deuda pública, a los salarios. En definitiva, lo que nosotros estamos proponiendo desde la teoría monetaria moderna es una, digamos, alternativa, una teoría de la inflación alternativa y una estrategia de objetivos de inflación distinta a la que están practicando los bancos centrales actualmente, ¿no?
Yeah, and I'll close with an answer to a follow-up question from Alfonso about what do we mean by market power or concentration of market power. Think of, in the case of the US, we have pharmaceutical companies who charge whatever they want, health insurance companies who charge whatever they want. They have pricing, abusive pricing behavior that's not regulated, that's not tamed by government regulation. But in the context developing countries or other countries that have maybe exclusive import licenses for food or fuel because it's a strategic resource for the country, those entities tend to have abusive pricing behavior. So for example, if you're importing gasoline for the whole country and you have that strategic role to play, you have that market power. So when global oil prices go up by 10%, you raise your gasoline prices accordingly, which makes sense. But when global oil prices come down, you don't reduce your gasoline prices accordingly because you can. Because nobody will force you not to do it if the government is not, paying attention and regulating. So that's what I mean by abusive market power. So if you want to reduce their power and influence in the economy and politics, you develop a domestic renewable energy industry, which they will not like. They'll try to do whatever they can to stop you. But that's what we're talking about. That's how you can see this market power as the force that suffocates the fiscal spending capacity of the country. And you can see the alternative policy, which is renewable energy or sustainable agriculture, as the policies that will democratize, that will actually increase the fiscal spending capacity. So now you can have a government that spends more on health without having to worry about, what will those doctors and nurses do with the money? They're going to import more food, they're going to import more energy, and they're going to cause inflation. Once you build that internal resilience, then you can think more strategically without having to worry about these inflation pass-through effects. And it's a long-term sustained policy. It can't happen overnight, but it can happen gradually by shifting subsidies, existing subsidies, away from subsidizing fuels, for example, in many countries, subsidizing basic foods, into investing in resilient food production systems domestically and so on. Sorry, this was long.
Yeah, I think I'm trying to write down some notes. Okay, so, pregunta también a continuación Alfonso, ¿qué entendemos, qué entiende por poder de mercado? y cita el ejemplo de la industria farmacéutica y las industrias de seguros médicos de Estados Unidos, que tienen una capacidad de fijar precios abusivas, digamos, porque no hay una buena reglamentación desde el Estado, ¿no? En otros países puede tratarse, por ejemplo, de aquellos que tienen licencias de importación, que tienen una cierta capacidad de determinar precios abusivos y, bueno, por ejemplo, pues una empresa importadora de energía, pues tiene la capacidad de subir el precio de los combustibles cuando sube el precio del petróleo a nivel internacional, cosa que tiene su lógica, pero luego cuando cae el precio del petróleo, pues no reducen los precios de sus productos finales porque tienen esa capacidad abusiva, ¿no? Entonces, bueno, en el caso de, como ejemplo de estrategias que se pueden aplicar contra este tipo de digamos, actividades con poder de mercado, pues cita la posibilidad, por ejemplo, de fomentar el desarrollo de energías renovables y, bueno, que le quitan poder de mercado y eso aumenta a su vez la capacidad fiscal del Estado porque, bueno, si esas puntos de presión inflacionista se mitigan o desaparecen, pues una vez que gastemos, ¿no?, en salarios de maestros, médicos, etcétera, ya no tendremos que preocuparnos por lo que van a hacer con su poder de gasto y que lo gasten en alimentos, en vestimenta o en energía y por tanto, bueno, pues podrán empezar a invertir recursos en otras áreas más estratégicas, ¿no? Entonces, por ejemplo, pues hay muchos casos de países que subvencionan la alimentación, la energía, precisamente para hacer frente a esos problemas de costes. Bueno, pues hacer este tipo de estrategias de mitigación de la concentración de poder en mercado, pues puede ayudar a que esos recursos se puedan destinar a otras prioridades, ¿no?
Thank you. Yeah, there are other questions in the chat.
Yeah, I'll read through them. Yeah. Yeah, Miquel Bassart has 3 questions. You have them in the chat, so maybe you can read them.
Yeah, I see them if you want to.
And I'll translate them.
Do the translation?
Yeah, I'll do that. So, Miquel Bassart creo que está en París, si no recuerdo mal, pregunta cómo puede la cooperación entre países en desarrollo contribuir a expandir su capacidad fiscal o su espacio de política, perdón. Segunda pregunta, ¿hay compromisos de los países desarrollados que podrían contribuir al desarrollo del resto de las naciones? Aquí tienen en mente el Target 2 de Keynes. No sé si te refieres al Bancor, no sé a qué te refieres por Target 2, que pone la responsabilidad de ajuste sobre los países con superávit por oposición a los acuerdos o los arreglos vigentes que funcionan de la otra manera. So I think, I'm not sure if Miquel means the Bancor.
Yeah.
I think that's what he means, because Target 2 is in the Eurozone payment system. So maybe he got mixed up there. Yeah.
Yeah. So, yeah, good question. So the first question is something that I'm actively working on, and it's really a reference to the concept of South-South trade. As in the global South cooperation. So instead of having free trade zones between like less developed countries with developed countries, you have competition and coordination amongst equals, so to speak, from a competitive standpoint. So to me, the best strategy, and this is an important strategy for industrialization, for strategic investments, one of the limitations that small developing countries have is that you don't have enough internal demand. If you want to, let's say, produce bicycles, right? You import bicycles from Germany or from whatever, and you only have 10 million people. I mean, how many bicycles can you produce domestically and have a thriving, market? You're going to need exports, right? For any manufacturing product, you're going to need to rely on exports. The problem is that you have barriers to exports through competition or other barriers, trade or non, direct or non-indirect barriers. With South-South trade, you can have a block of 10 developing countries, say neighboring countries, who are equally competitive, equally developed, have maybe a variety of advantages in certain areas in terms of resources and so on. But collectively, they have now a market of 150 million consumers. So now you can have multiple manufacturers competing and developing and improving in that region and moving up the ladder in terms of the quality and the price at which they can sell.
Okay. Perdona. Respecto a la primera pregunta, es un aspecto en el que él está trabajando mucho y es la idea del comercio sur-sur como en contraposición a los modelos predominantes, ¿no?, de zonas de libre comercio que incluyen a países más y menos desarrollados y, por tanto, países desiguales, ¿no? La idea es crear esa cooperación entre iguales. Y entonces, bueno, pues puede ser una buena estrategia de desarrollo porque el problema es que muchos países están limitados por la demanda interna que tienen, ¿no? Si es un país relativamente pequeño, por ejemplo, de 10 millones de habitantes y te quieres poner a construir o fabricar bicicletas, el problema es cuántas bicicletas tiene tu mercado doméstico, ¿no?, capacidad de absorber, y es evidente que en muchos países será necesario recurrir a las exportaciones, pero ahí te encuentras con una serie de barreras, tanto arancelarias como no arancelarias, y eso hace pues muy complicado adquirir economías de escala, ¿no? Bueno, pues y además desarrollar la tecnología para competir internacionalmente, ¿no? Si vamos a un modelo de cooperación sur-sur que reúna a países que pueden tener diversas ventajas competitivas, bueno, en ese caso, bueno, puede surgir entonces ese mercado suficientemente grande y eso le da una oportunidad a los fabricantes de bueno, pues alcanzar esas economías de escala, de conseguir mejores precios, de ir subiendo en la escala de la cadena de la valor, etcétera, ¿no? Okay.
Yeah, so the key in these types of strategic investments and cooperation is not to reverse back to the 1950s and 60s protective industries, protectionist policies that gave those industries full protection without requirement of improvement in productivity and quality and service to customers. I think this is the difference between what we've experienced in many, many developing countries versus what we've experienced, for example, in Japan or in Korea or in Singapore. Although many of those were under some form of dictatorship, right? Pretty brutal systems, but it doesn't have to be that way. We can develop kind of democratically organized strategic investments. So that's one component. I'll stop here and then I have something else to say, so I'll give you a chance to translate.
Okay. Sí, entonces aquí la clave está entonces en no volver a esos modelos de la década de los 50, 60 del siglo pasado, en el que bueno, pues se protegía la industria doméstica, pero esa protección les eximía de alguna forma de hacer el esfuerzo de desarrollar la industria en el sentido de bueno, pues de aumentar su productividad, de tener la atención al cliente y la calidad que se exigiría, ¿no? Y por tanto, pues no llegar a desarrollar una industria competitiva, ¿no? Aunque otros países como Japón, Corea del Sur, etcétera, sí que desarrollaron industrias competitivas. Aunque un problema de esos países también, algunos de esos países que lo hicieron bajo modelos dictatoriales, en algunos casos dictaduras bastante brutales, pero él piensa que esto se puede hacer en un modelo de sociedad más democrático, ¿no? Y bueno, pues you can go on.
Yep. So the example I gave is very simplistic. Bicycles, right? Who cares at the end of the day? So now we're talking about more serious things like renewable energy infrastructure, high-speed trains, telecommunication systems, medical equipment. This is where, you know, most of the issues are. So now we're talking about, you know, not a single country can even handle the research and development and production capabilities. So this is where you have to have, you know, those 10 countries working in a collaborative strategic research and development and in investment. The advantage is now you have 150 million consumers, right? But now how do you actually build this stuff? And I think one of the most useful models to think of is a European model, which is the way Europe developed Airbus as an alternative to Boeing or as a competitor to Boeing. There's no way a single European country could have competed with Boeing, right, at the level that Airbus does today. So how did the collaboration model work? You know, Airbus is not owned by a single country, is not, you know, supported by a single country. It's a collaboration of several European nations that put resources for research and development, but collectively create a large market share for the company. But it's not about being a monopoly and fully subsidized, even though they're actually subsidized, just like Boeing is subsidized by the US government. But most of the benefits of that collaboration is in the research and development, is in sharing the capital investment load, and in also making sure that you have shared employment opportunities. Not all the Airbus aircraft are assembled or produced in a single country. So you have this horizontal integration of industrial development, which is what you want in any industrial strategy. You don't want vertical integration, which is you bring inputs from outside and you drop them into an assembly line. You want horizontal integration where you have multiple units within the block producing components and producing value added that builds up to the final product. Whereas in the current system, the global supply chain, we have a broken system where countries receive, in a horizontal way, receive components and assemble them. And as a result, you end up with developing countries having the lowest value added content. So I'll say one more thing about the importance of competition within the South-South model, because I think it will be an interesting nuance for a lot of people.
Muy bien. Y bueno, pues aquí el ejemplo, digamos, de las bicicletas, pues puede resultar un poco simple, pero nos tenemos que fijar, pues, por ejemplo, en proyectos como los de las energías renovables, los trenes de alta velocidad, el equipamiento médico. Ninguno de los países del sur probablemente pueda abordar o tenga las capacidades de investigación y desarrollo como para abordarlo en solitario. Pero si son 115 millones de habitantes en ese acuerdo de colaboración, pues quizás empiecen sí a tener ya esa capacidad. Y un ejemplo de ese tipo de desarrollo colaborativo es el caso de los países europeos, cómo se creó Airbus como un consorcio que pudo competir contra Boeing y producir aviones de una calidad suficiente como para competir con ellos, ¿no? Ningún país en solitario, ningún país europeo en solitario habría podido hacerlo. Y bueno, pues ese ha sido un modelo exitoso en el que, bueno, pues cada país, pues en vez de ir a un modelo de monopolio, ¿no? O de subsidiar un monopolio, lo que se hace es construir digamos, capacidades de I+D, que se reparte, digamos, el esfuerzo de la carga de inversión y de la capacidad y digamos, de los requerimientos de capital, ¿no? Eso genera además oportunidades de empleo compartidas y, bueno, pues es un modelo de integración horizontal frente al modelo dominante de integración vertical, ¿no? En un modelo de orientación vertical, pues hay que ir suministrando o aprovisionando componentes, y el problema del modelo vertical actualmente dominante en las cadenas de valor globales es que algunos países se ven al final condenados a la incorporación de componentes de otros países y se acaban quedando en los tramos de valor añadido más bajo, ¿no? En un modelo de valor añadido bajo. Okay. Y va a hacer un comentario adicional sobre la competencia.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing before the competition comment, because I just remembered, which is we often get these questions. I mean, how can the global north help? How can we help alleviate some of these problems? And I think the answer to that question has to start with first having a coherent internal strategy in the global south. So my statement is always, if you don't have a strategic plan for yourself, you're always going to be part of somebody else's strategic plan. So that's number one. So having a clear vision that says, these are the priorities, this is how we're going to collaborate. And then if there's, real assistance from the global north, it could come in the form of transfer of technology in terms of strategic cooperation, but it's always as part of your vision, not as part of the IMF plan for the country, right? So that's point number one. Do you want me to stop here, or I can add the competition?
Yep. Okay. Vale, pues a veces se pregunta cómo puede ayudar el norte global, digamos, a los países de menos desarrollados y bueno, pues una forma evidentemente puede ser entregar tecnología, ayudas, pero tiene que haber una estrategia coherente en el sur global, porque si no tienes tu propia estrategia te acabas convirtiendo, digamos, en un peón en la estrategia de otro, ¿no? Entonces, sí, está bien en un modelo de cooperación donde haya transferencias del norte de tecnología y otros recursos, pero es importante contar con tu propia visión estratégica. Okay?
Yeah. So that includes research and development funding for universities, actual partnerships and developing indigenous technologies and things like that.
Sí, eso incluye I+D, la financiación de las universidades, el desarrollo de tecnologías nativas, etc.
So on the competition side, one of the things that we hear all the time that free trade is great because it enhances competition, and competition is good because you provide better quality and lower prices for consumers and so on. The metaphor that I like to use, which eventually will bring us to the South-South trade as I think the better model, is sports metaphors like boxing. In boxing, we don't allow a heavyweight champion to fight a lightweight boxing champion. It's illegal, it's ugly, nobody wants to watch it, at least I don't want to watch it. But what we do in sports is that we allow a heavyweight champion to compete with a heavyweight champion and a lightweight champion to compete with a lightweight champion. We just don't do that in real economic and trade policies. We allow a heavyweight country or region like the EU or the United States or Japan to destroy a local, a small country's economy in the name of competition. And then you end up with that weaker degree of monetary sovereignty, lack of food resilience, lack of energy resilience, and so on. So the free trade model is destructive by design.
Cuando se le pregunta por la competencia, se suele argumentar que el libre comercio al final es bueno, es magnífico porque mejora la competencia, eso lleva a precios más bajos, mejores productos, etc. El problema es que eso digamos, la falacia de ese argumento se puede explicar con una metáfora deportiva. En el caso del boxeo, por ejemplo, pues no toleramos que los pesos pesados luchen contra los pesos pluma, ¿no? Porque eso sería un deporte feo, ilegal, a nadie le gustaría ver eso, ¿no? Lo que toleramos es que los pesos pesados compitan contra los pesos pesados. Pues en caso de la política económica y comercial, sí que estamos tolerando esa competencia entre desiguales. Y al final toleramos que economías como Estados Unidos, o las de Estados Unidos o la de Japón, acaben destruyendo la economía de otros países menos desarrollados, porque no están compitiendo en igualdad de condiciones y acaban con una dependencia energética, alimentaria, etc. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. And then finally, I want to answer the second question that Mikhail asked, which is about the Keynes plan, the Bancorp plan. So a couple of things, because this could be a long answer. One is Jan Kregel, I think, just published a paper at the Levy Institute in which he's trying to revive the Keynes plan. So I encourage everybody to take a look at it. It's levy.org, the website, and I think it's the last publication by Jan Kregel. Point number two, in the recorded presentation that we had earlier, I made a reference to climate and colonial reparations. So in that global Green New Deal framework that I'm trying to put together, the part that I didn't explain in the recorded portion is how do you structure this global financial architecture in order to undo the existing mechanics, which, as I said earlier, takes $2 trillion annually from the global south to the global north. We need to reverse that to begin with. Otherwise, we have no hope of moving forward. And my proposal is to use the Keynes plan, because it is a solid plan, as the new financial architecture for transfer of financial resources, for transfer of reparation payments, and make that a permanent system. So for those of you who are new to this idea, Keynes's proposal at the end of World War II. Maybe I should stop here and let you translate.
Yeah,
and then,
I think so, because, bueno, en cuanto a la pregunta respecto al plan Bancor de Keynes, en 2 puntos. Primero, hay un paper de Jan Kregel que se acaba de publicar en el Levy Institute, que nos invita, en la que plantea revivirlo y que nos invita a leerlo. Luego pasaremos el enlace por aquí. No sé si Carlos o alguien podría pasar el enlace al Levy Institute por el chat. Y el segundo punto es que cuando bueno, en la parte grabada habló de las reparaciones coloniales para, ¿no? Cuando se hablaba del reto climático, ¿no? Y bueno, pues y cómo se podía estructurar un Green New Deal global y cómo estructuraríamos la canalización de la ayuda financiera, ¿no? Porque actualmente lo que está ocurriendo es que digamos el sur global está viendo cómo se succionan de 2.000 a 3.000 millones de dólares todos los años hacia el norte, ¿no? Entonces su propuesta es precisamente se basa en una versión del plan Keynes, que es lo que vamos a explicar ahora. So, go ahead.
So for those of you who are not familiar with the Keynes plan, this was during the Bretton Woods negotiations in 1945. The Keynes plan was to create the World Bank, to create the IMF, but also to create this third institution that will act as a global balancing mechanism for balance of payments deficits for developing for countries that will have well, at the time there were no developing countries, they were all colonies. But the idea was to avoid what happened between World War I and World War II, which was the currency wars between European countries, the beggar the neighbor policies were called at the time. So what's the Keynes plan? Well, the Keynes plan didn't make it. We ended up just with the World Bank and the IMF. We ended up with the American plan, not the British plan. So Keynes's plan was the following. As a globe, we can't all have trade surpluses. You know, some country, at least one country, has to have a trade deficit. If not, it's a large number of countries, unless we trade with a different planet and we all have a trade surplus, right? So that's a realistic starting point. Point number two, those countries that will have structural trade deficits systematically, which is developing countries today, will always have pressure on their exchange rate, will always have something like an inflation pass-through effect, which means it will suffocate their spending capacity and will not allow them to have full employment to invest in health and education and infrastructure. And those countries will systematically fall behind, right? So Keynes's proposal is to introduce a mechanism that will allow them to reverse that. So I'll pause here and then I'll continue after you translate.
Entonces, el plan de Keynes se discutió en Bretton Woods en 1945. En esa conferencia, Bretton Woods, se crearon el Banco Mundial y el Fondo Monetario Internacional, y él abogaba por una institución adicional que consiguiera un equilibrio mundial en las balanzas de pagos. En aquella época la mayor parte de lo que ahora llamamos países menos desarrollados eran colonias, pero sobre todo lo que se trataba de evitar eran las guerras de divisas y las políticas mercantilistas, ¿no? de aprovecharse del vecino. Entonces, bueno, la idea de partida es que no todos los países pueden tener un superávit comercial simultáneamente, al menos uno tiene que tener un déficit comercial, a no ser que encontremos un planeta con el que, digamos, extraterrestre con el que comerciar. Y entonces, bueno, pues la idea es que estos países que tienen menos desarrollados van a tener una cierta presión sobre su divisa porque van a tener un déficit comercial. Esa tensión o esa presión depreciadora de su divisa tendrá efectos de transmisión a precios finales y acabará también provocando una restricción del gasto, ¿no? Bueno, pues entonces, I think, I can't remember, there was one last phrase I think you said after you mentioned the pass-through effects and these growth suffocation. I can't remember what you said.
Oh,
sorry.
Those countries end up suffering because they can't implement full employment policies.
Sí. Y esos países acaban sufriendo porque no pueden implantar políticas de pleno empleo. Okay, go on.
So Keynes's proposal was to create an international clearing union. Think of it as an agency that sits on top of all central banks, a lender of last resort, so to speak, to central banks. It will create a unit of account called the Bancor, which will be a monetary unit that only central banks would use for internal accounting. It will not be something that the public would use. And the role of this system would be to tell the surplus countries, you have a few choices in terms of what you do with your surplus in your Bancor account. You can spend your surplus domestically to create domestic full employment, which will be great for your economy. Or you can spend your surplus to import stuff from other countries, which will be great because it will help boost their economies and create jobs in other economies. Or you can grant it to friendly nations or to charity or whatever in other countries to help developing countries, deficit countries, kind of create more jobs and develop. And if you don't spend it, say, within a 3-year period, the international agency will take the surpluses and allocate them to countries that need them the most to rebalance the global economy. Well, of course, this was unacceptable for countries that were obsessed with mercantilist strategies because they wanted to accumulate more surpluses. At the time, the U.S. opposed it because it was very clear after 1945, the U.S. was going to be clearly the trade surplus country because Europe was destroyed, Japan was destroyed. So the U.S. didn't want a foreign agency, an international agency, take its surplus and potentially give it to an unfriendly nation, right? But instead, the U.S. did precisely that and took its surplus and gave it to Europe as a Marshall Plan. But that was a strategic choice, not an international agency making that decision for the U.S.
Bien, entonces la idea del plan Bancor era crear una cámara de compensación internacional y que actuara además como prestamista de último recurso, y que emplearía una unidad de cuenta que se habría llamado Bancor, que solo podría utilizar los bancos centrales. Digamos, no sería una moneda de curso, digamos, ordinario. Y el mecanismo funciona de tal forma, o estaba diseñado de tal forma, que los países con superávit comercial que acumularan saldos de Bancor tendrían 3 opciones con esos saldos. Una posibilidad habría sido gastarlo en el mercado doméstico y elevar el nivel de vida de su población y, por tanto, tener un efecto, digamos, de tirón de las importaciones. Una segunda posibilidad podría haber sido gastarlo en importaciones y de esa forma impulsar el crecimiento económico de otros países en desarrollo. Y la tercera posibilidad habría sido donarlo a un país amistoso, ¿no? A un país amigo o a una organización sin ánimo de lucro o no gubernamental, bueno, pues para facilitar su desarrollo, ¿no? De tal forma que si no gastabas esos saldos de Bancor, al final este organismo internacional se apropiaría de esos saldos y los destinaría digamos, a aquellos países o necesidades más acuciantes, ¿no? Aquel programa o aquella propuesta resultó inaceptable para los países que querían desarrollar una política mercantilista y finalmente pues Estados Unidos no quiso apoyarlo porque sabía que en 1945, cuando estaba Europa destruida tras la guerra, pues que ellos iban a ser la nación con el superávit comercial, y finalmente lo que hicieron fue con sus excedentes de ahorro, pues los destinaron a financiar el plan Marshall. Aquello no fue, sin embargo, una decisión que adoptó una agencia internacional, sino una decisión estratégica que adoptó Estados Unidos porque estaba alineada con sus intereses estratégicos.
So you can see why the Keynes plan was always politically difficult, because you always have countries that will object to it. Today, China would object to it. Germany would object to it. Japan, Saudi Arabia, all the major, exporters would not want to see their export surplus taken away and not allowed to accumulate foreign currency reserves in a mercantilist way. So that being the case, I'll be the first one to tell you that you can implement a Keynes plan if this was politically acceptable. We can implement a Keynes plan in a good way. You can also implement it in a bad way from a development perspective. If a Keynes plan is there to fuel the same extractive economic development model, to fuel the dependence on foreign energy, on food imports, and so on, it will still trap developing countries in the same type of situation, but with the less kind of severe impact, because you always have a lender of last resort to rebalance your economy at the end of the year, at the end of the cycle. So now, my proposal for a global Green New Deal is not talking about donations or charity from the global north to the global south. It's talking about repairing the damage, as in, repairing, paying for the climate debt, paying for colonial and post-colonial debt, which means massive amount of, transfer of financial resources and real resources and technology to the global south. So to coordinate this, I think, we have the moral, ethical, legal case to be made for reparations, for climate reparations and colonial reparations. I think we have a clear-cut view of, who will be paying whom. It's the global north, generally speaking, that will be transferring resources to the global south. I think the Keynes proposal makes this more of a formal mechanism where we can, let's call this unit, we don't have to call it the bank, or call it the green coin or something like that, where all central banks can coordinate transfer of resources to the global south in order to accelerate the transition, in order to build resilience in developing countries, food, energy resilience, and so on. And you can think of bits and pieces of this plan are already in place. I'll give you an example. And the Keynes plan, by the way, reemerges every time there is a global crisis. But then it's immediately, put back on the shelf because some country will object to it. So the bits and pieces that are in place that we can build on to create the equivalent of a Bancor system, or this global green coin system, are swap lines that central banks have created during financial crises. The Fed right now has direct swap lines with the ECB, with the Swiss bank, with the Bank of Japan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. But those are exclusive to a handful of privileged countries who have the Fed today as a lender of last resort. Why? Because they want to stabilize their currencies because of global imbalances with those particular economies. What I'm proposing here, what Keynes was proposing initially, is not have the Fed play that role, have an actual international agency play that role and play it permanently, as opposed to only during crises and only limited to a handful of, friendly nations that you want to support?
Vale, bueno, el plan Keynes, como podemos suponer, pues siempre ha tenido dificultades políticas, sobre todo de los países con superávit comercial, países como Japón, Alemania, China, pues seguramente no querrían que sus excedentes comerciales fueran expropiados, ¿no? Se puede implantar un plan Keynes, quizás de otra manera. Quizás el plan Keynes en sí mismo, bueno, pues sería un modelo que sería difícil de implantar, pero dentro del contexto de un Green Global New Deal, o sea, un nuevo pacto verde global, se podría, digamos, estructurar en torno a las donaciones y las transferencias que tienen que hacer, que deberían hacer los países del norte hacia el sur global en pago por indemnizaciones por la deuda histórica, por el coste que se les ha infligido por el cambio climático, etcétera. Y esa transferencia de recursos del norte hacia el sur se podría estructurar desde los bancos centrales, ¿no? Que serían los encargados de organizar esas transferencias organizar ese digamos, nuevo plan Keynes, pero en torno a ese Global Green New Deal, ¿no? Hay elementos que ya están de alguna forma montados, y un ejemplo pueden ser las líneas de swap, las líneas de canje de divisas que periódicamente intercambian los bancos centrales, pero los bancos centrales de ciertos países privilegiados, digamos, como por ejemplo la Reserva Federal de los Estados Unidos, el Banco Central Europeo, los bancos centrales de los países, digamos, más avanzados, que están interesados más bien en estabilizar las divisas, ¿no? La propuesta del Global Green New Deal precisamente trataría de evitar o sacar, digamos, ese tipo de acuerdos de unos acuerdos que se hacen entre un club privilegiado y tratar de extenderlos a los bancos centrales de otros países. Una cosa que se me ha olvidado mencionar, que estoy leyendo ahora en mis notas, que tomo así a vuela pluma, es que si el plan de Keynes se aplicara para seguir alimentando el mismo modelo de desarrollo actualmente vigente, pues no conseguiríamos resolver los grandes problemas de dependencia, de ubicación en cadenas de valor de menor valor añadido, o sea, en los tramos de menor valor añadido de las cadenas de valor, etcétera. O sea, tendríamos quizás menores tensiones financieras, pero seguiríamos perpetuando los mismos errores que actualmente estamos cometiendo en las propuestas que se hacen para desarrollar las economías menos avanzadas, ¿no? Okay.
Okay, I'll just close this question by saying, we do have practical solutions. At the end of the day, these are political commitment choices that so far we've opted not to use.
Sí, al final, bueno, para cerrar, pues tenemos soluciones prácticas. Al final son decisiones políticas las que determinan que las utilicemos o no. I'm going to do one more question because it is getting very late here and in Europe. It's 9:15 and some people might want to disconnect. So I think there's a question from Jorge Amar about the complementary currency. I think you can read it. I'll read it out. I'll translate into Spanish. Sobre la moneda complementaria, ¿qué podría evitar que el Banco Central, lo ilegalizara como hizo el Banco Central de Austria con el experimento de Bergel en los años 30, ¿no? Incluso en España una propuesta de moneda complementaria fue atacada por el subgobernador del Banco de España, ¿no? No sé si conocen el experimento Bergel, pero fue un modelo de moneda local muy exitoso que se desarrolló en la Austria de la época de la depresión y que fue, bueno, precisamente se basaba en que los impuestos locales se pagaban en esa moneda local y el experimento fue abortado por el Banco Central Austriaco, ¿no? So, go ahead.
So the question is, why do central banks and governments in general, try to ban complementary currencies when they grow to, visible proportions? Several reasons. In some cases, it's fear of being undermined by a rising alternative, and we've seen that in some cases, even in developing countries, where the central bank or the Ministry of Finance will sue the agencies or the organizations that create the complementary currency and prosecute them as counterfeiters, especially as the currency gains strength and becomes traded one-to-one in the market. It becomes perceived as counterfeit money by government agencies. But in some cases, if you see the rise of an alternative currency and its potential, and you ban it, but you don't provide the alternative, then we have a problem. So in the case of the US in the 1930s, when Chicago economist Fisher, I'm blanking on Fisher's first name for some reason. You know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, Fisher.
Right,
Yeah.
Fisher. The name will come back.
Yeah.
When he wrote a little pamphlet reporting on the Austrian experience with complementary currency, and handed it to the U.S. Treasury, to economists and policymakers in D.C., they thought that he's maybe crazy or something. So they requested a report from a couple of Harvard economists just to double check his work and see if this makes any sense. And they went back to the Treasury and said, yeah, this will work. This makes perfect sense. So that's when FDR stepped in and said, you know what, we're not going to do complementary currencies anymore. We're going to do the New Deal. So he stepped in with the alternative, right? But if you don't provide the alternative for public investment, for reviving the economy, I don't think it's a good idea to ban, individuals and communities who are trying to do their best. So I think this is usually the tension. Is sometimes it's the IMF. In the case of Europe, there were proposals for Greece during the crisis 10 years ago, and they were immediately shut down by the Troika, because that would undermine the validity and the kind of the dominance of the euro and will loosen up the constraints that the Eurozone rules are imposing on countries.
Sí, la pregunta es por qué los bancos centrales tratan de prohibir estas divisas complementarias, ¿no? Cuando, bueno, pues pueden ser un elemento útil, ¿no? Y una de las razones puede ser ese temor a que sea socave, ¿no? La validez de su política monetaria, ¿no? E incluso llegan los bancos centrales a denunciarlos por falsificadores, ¿no? Pero bueno, el problema es que si lo prohíbes tienes que dar la alternativa. Si no das la alternativa, entonces es cuando creas el problema. Ahí cita el ejemplo de Marvin Fisher, ¿no? ¿Cómo se llamaba el Fisher? Nadie se acuerda. Irving Fisher, eso es. Irving Fisher, sí, ya no me acordaba tampoco. Fue el que propuso, bueno, escribió un panfleto allá por los años 30 precisamente sobre el experimento de Bergel en Austria, y se lo entregó a políticos y al Banco Central, y bueno, pues inicialmente la reacción fue pensar que estaba loco o que podía ser una locura. Entonces decidieron contrastar con unos economistas de Harvard, que, bueno, le analizaron el asunto y dijeron que aquello tenía sentido y que podía funcionar, ¿no? Y en ese momento, pues, Franklin Delano Roosevelt decidió que no iba a tolerar esa vía, pero produjo la alternativa, que fue el nuevo deal, ¿no? El New Deal, o sea, el nuevo trato, que fue la que permitió, digamos, sacar a Estados Unidos de la situación en la que se encontraba desde desde la Gran Depresión, ¿no? Ha habido múltiples experimentos en Europa que han sido también abordados por el Banco Central Europeo. Bueno, más bien por la Troika. En el caso de Grecia hubo intentos de montar monedas complementarias y fueron abortados por la Troika porque, bueno, pues se podían de alguna forma comprometer el tipo de política de austeridad y de devaluación interna que estaban proponiendo. Okay. I think that was a very interesting conversation, and I really thoroughly enjoyed the whole interview. It's been a long session, so I don't know if anybody has a very quick question to make. That would be fine, but I think otherwise we will end it for the day. And especially in this side of the Atlantic, it's getting very late. So anyhow, this is recorded. We will make it available. Hemos grabado toda la entrevista. Estará a disposición de todos en nuestra página web, en nuestro canal de YouTube, en Twitter, y yo creo que aquí hay ideas muy interesantes para seguir discutiendo, analizando entre nosotros, y sin duda tendremos que hacer un congreso MMT internacional para los países de habla española, porque creo que a mí se me ha hecho, vamos, a mí me ha sabido a poco esto, ¿no? Creo que tenemos que plantearnos probablemente en septiembre, hemos pensado hacer un congreso al que invitaremos a todos a participar. Y ahí habrá oportunidad para estas múltiples conversaciones que han tenido lugar hoy sobre temas muy importantes. Cada uno de ellos merecía por separado una sesión, ¿no? Y probablemente esta conversación tenía que haber durado 5 horas o 6 horas, pero eso no es posible. Así que aquí van a salir temas para discutir más a fondo. Muchísimas gracias a Fadhel Kaboub por su dedicación. Le he tenido ocupado en enero, que ya lo entrevisté para hacer la versión subtitulada, y ahora nos ha dedicado otra hora más, así que muchísimas gracias por su generosidad. So thanks a lot for your time, Fadhel. It was great, wonderful conversation. And I was saying that there were so many topics that we covered, and probably too superficially, that we need to probably have 4 or 5 sessions with you and others to discuss them in further depth. And I was just mentioning that we want to have an international MMT conference in Spanish. Probably in September we will have a congress, and I hope everybody is invited, and hope we'll be able to host you again in September. So thanks a lot for your time.
Thank you, appreciate it.
Okay, and then of course this is recorded, so you'll all be able to watch this again if you're interested. Okay. Okay. Bye, everybody.
Bye.